I was still breathing heavily and told them to start a fire with a carpet that was lying on the floor. So-yeon could not just watch her classmates suffer. Even though he hated her, she now realized that she had to do something. Even if she was rejected, she would know that she had done everything in her power. So-yeon dared to say words of encouragement to Yeon-woo, but she was interrupted by Isuri, who approached her friend again and asked him louder and more confidently if he was okay. The boy could barely speak, but he was able to say Isuri's name. So-yeon watched the whole thing and even moved a little closer to her classmates. She acted very cautiously because she was still afraid of being judged. Isuri told Yeon-woo that he was dripping with cold sweat. He turned pale and looked very unhealthy, which was hard to ignore. They both looked at Yeon-woo's hand. It was shaking with pain. Then the boy looked down again, at the monsters and people who were turning into zombie monsters. Yeon-woo realized that he was feeling something very strange and unusual, something he had never felt before. The sensations were from the very tips of his fingers. The guy assumed that he felt what the monsters around him felt. Meanwhile, a military man and another had already set fire to the carpets and successfully scared away the zombie monsters around them. Two men were talking to each other. One of them asked if his friend was okay, and they answered that he needed something quickly. Everyone was working for their salvation and running errands. Meanwhile, Seo-young realized that she was the third person in their conversation, so she had to switch to something else. Suddenly, she noticed that Kang-min was standing behind her, seemingly filming something with his phone. She decided to ask him what he was doing. It even scared the guy a little out of surprise. So-yeon approached her classmate. They were standing right next to the railing at the edge of the balcony. She asked what Kang-min was doing and why he was staring at the ground floor. Kang-min was a little confused by this question, but decided to be honest and answered that he was just observing. Of course, Seo-young was surprised by this answer. Kang-min went on to say that they were all just running away from these zombie monsters all the time. But if they kept doing that, it would never end. And now, the boy had to understand what those creatures were. Meanwhile, Park Min and Ham Sung-yu were actively looking out the window. They were indignant that the army was still not there. No one was in a hurry to save them. Meanwhile, the tent where the aid was being provided and where Lee Tae-in was being burned by the military. It seems that it was not safe because there were monsters in it. Inside were workers in blue uniforms. I think they were the ones Lee Tae-in was bullying. A military officer was telling someone on the radio that the virus had already spread at control point number 3, but they had successfully managed to burn down the quarantine zone. Suddenly, he added on the radio that they were going to start setting fire to the shelters. They were not even going to rescue people who were probably not infected. Meanwhile, the people inside were successfully burning the shelter themselves. There were a dozen zombie monsters on the floor of the room, actively transforming. Meanwhile, on the balcony, they were shouting for everyone to move to the wall and stand aside as quickly as possible. The tent caught fire very strongly. The fire was at the height of the buildings. The people inside were also already suffocating from the smoke and stench emitted by the fire and burning carpets. There was a risk of smoke poisoning. They ran to the window and saw the tent burning. This did not add to their hopes. Suddenly, something terrible happened. The floor of the balcony began to crack. A zombie monster was crawling out from inside it, like a stalk of a plant sprouting from the ground. The tentacles of slime and the frog egg virus were approaching people in search of new victims. The crowd began to panic and scream because the zombie monster was very close. They needed to get out of the room to save themselves. Someone shouted that everything should be burned. Another said not to go crazy, because then the whole building would catch fire with them. To which he was told that of course the building would catch fire, because they were the ones who set it on fire. Others said that if they had waited a little longer, the military would have rescued them. They did not know that no one was going to save them. They were only going to burn them alive. Park Min was nervous. His heart was beating faster and he was inhaling loudly and deeply, out of control. Suddenly, he noticed Yeon-woo and Isuri sitting on the floor quite calmly talking about something. Meanwhile, people were still arguing about what they should have done and why the military had not yet come to rescue them. Yeon-woo and Isuri talked about how the boy had already dated a man who was immune. He was talking about Lee Tae-in. Isuri, like the boyfriend, did not believe these words at first, because this phenomenon was not common and seemed rather strange. After all, how could someone be immune to a virus that had never been in the world before? Yeon-woo continued that the man seemed to know a lot about the virus and the incubation period for a regular volunteer. For some reason, this information made Isuri angry, and she got angry. She asked where this guy was now, whom Yeon-woo had told her about, but the teenager did not know this information, unfortunately. But he went on to say that they didn't understand anything because the virus was inactive and no symptoms were showing up. And if it suddenly activated and spread, there would be nothing they could do. Isuri looked at Yeon-woo and listened intently. For some reason, she trusted this stranger. Yeon-woo looked down. His eyes were completely upset, and the pain did not subside, but it seemed that the boy himself was used to it. Tears or sweat were pouring out of his eyes. Suddenly, the guy remembered that even the last time he came face to face with a person whose virus had already spread through his body, he did not feel as much pain as he did now. The guy came back to reality and looked at the people in front of him, more precisely, at the man in the shirt who was sitting on his knees. Yeon-woo looked at him and said that he was in pain again, even though he was not near the activated virus. The guy was like an X-ray. He saw through the man. The boy looked at the floor again. There were so many thoughts running through his head. He could not cope with them alone, and he wanted to talk to someone so that he would not have to carry this burden alone. Park Min was watching their conversation, but he didn't seem to hear them. Suddenly, he called out to his classmates. Ham Seong-yu joined him to watch. Now, the classmates looked together at Jeonhwa and Isuri, who looked quite close. Park Min told Ham Seong-yu that it was quite strange that from that moment on, they were always together all the time. Meanwhile, Kang Ji-hoon opened his friend Lee Hong-mi's channel and noticed her new video. It made him a little angry. It seems that the guy was worried about her, that even though she was in danger, Han-mi was still recording and posting videos for her channel. Kang Min heard this and said that he had already watched the video, but the connection was not clear. He suggested that maybe Han-mi had accidentally turned on the recording, but that way, they could at least realize that the girl was definitely alive. This phrase motivated Kang Ji-hoon to act. He shouted that it was enough to sit around. It was clear that the headman wanted to get out of the room. Kang Ming immediately understood his friend's intentions because he knew him well. He asked him where the headman wanted to go. He added that they had to stay here, telling Kang Ji-hoon to take a look at something. Then, Kang Min took his phone and turned on the flashlight on it. The guy pointed the light down at an area of the floor that was clean. There wasn't even any white slime on it. All of a sudden, all the monsters in the area immediately came running to this area. It looked very ugly. Kang Min commented that the zombie monsters reacted to the light and immediately gathered together. So-yeon joined the conversation and asked Kang Ji-hoon what they would do if they left the shelter. She added that in that case, using a flashlight would be dangerous, and walking in the dark was even more dangerous. Kang Min supported So-yeon's opinion and said that from the outside they would not have seen anything. The boy continued to look at the zombie monsters gathering around the light. They looked like a whole herd about to bow to some kind of totem. Kang Ming watched everything carefully and studied their behavior. The boy asked if they could take some advantage of the fact that the zombie monsters were reacting and gathering near the light. Suddenly, a man in a brown shirt who was looking out the window suddenly screamed loudly with emotion. This attracted the attention of the others. The man said he saw the military behind the glass. They were walking to the shelter with machine guns. The man in the shirt turned to everyone and happily said that the military was coming to save them. The women began to cry because they hoped to be saved. People started shouting and banging on the window so that the military would notice them. One of the workers looked up and actually saw people in the window. They shouted that they were upstairs and asked the military to rescue them as soon as possible. People started shouting joyfully that they had been noticed, so they were saved. Suddenly, Kang Min and Kang Ji-hoon noticed something and turned around together and stared at it. It was Park Min and Ham Sung-yu staring back at the boys. Suddenly, the guys told them to stop staring at them so brazenly. The tension was building. And then, Ham Seong-yu gave me the middle finger. He felt very cool at that moment, as if he had done something important and noteworthy. Kang Ji-hoon reacted calmly to this miracle. He added that he seemed to care. Park Min then noticed something strange. It caught his attention. He looked at Jonah. He was sitting on the floor holding his hand. It was obvious that the boy was sick again. Isuri was not with him either. Meanwhile, the man and woman hugged each other and cried. They were happy to be safe. Suddenly, the woman looked down and saw Jonah screaming in pain, his arms shaking. The woman could not let it go and approached the boy to ask what happened to him and if he was okay. Suddenly, she saw something terrible. Her eyes grew very large and her pupils shrank. The woman screamed very loudly in fear. This attracted the attention of others, and everyone was looking at what was happening to Jeon-woo. The guy looked up. Everyone was horrified by what they saw. The teenager's eyes were white, without pupils. He was shaking for some reason, and sweat was pouring down his body. Then the woman screamed that Jeon-woo was infected. The woman started repeating and shouting that she was infected here. Meanwhile, Jeon-woo did not even hear it. He could only hear the echoes of her scream. The boy was feverish and no one was there to help him. The woman looked at him and shouted loudly that Yeon-woo looked exactly like the monster from the first floor and that everyone should get away from him. Suddenly, Yeon-woo began to regain consciousness. He looked at the woman who was screaming and staring at him. The boy's eyes returned to what they were, and he was no longer shaking. Although his consciousness took longer to recover, he was still able to see this crazy woman. Everything was blurring in his eyes. Suddenly, Yeon-woo noticed something terrible. Even in this light and condition, the guy noticed that a monster was sneaking up behind the woman. The nasty big zombie screamed, which meant that it had found its victim. Through the pain, Yeon-woo held out his healthy hand to the woman and shouted at her not to go there. But the woman screamed for Yeon-woo not to touch her and pulled away from the guy. She screamed at him and called the teenager a crazy psycho, but he only wanted to help her. The woman was so scared that she didn't look at what was in front of her. She was just running away. When the woman realized that she should look ahead when running, she saw something more terrifying in front of her than a teenager who was just cowering. There was a real huge zombie monster in front of the woman. It was growling at her and was 2 seconds away from attacking her. The chances of survival were minimal. The frightened woman did not even have time to react fully when the inevitable happened. The zombie monster released its white, ugly tentacles on the woman. She didn't have time to save herself or even scream. It happened so fast. In a matter of seconds, the poor victim was already lying on the floor, all wrapped up in the ugly white tentacles of a zombie monster. All the other people present watched. Her husband screamed in fear and pain from the loss of his closest person. Meanwhile, the woman was already in the clutches of the ugly giant. She was screaming from the pain she felt from the infection. The soldier quickly reacted to what happened and came to the rescue. Someone had to resolve the situation. He pushed the poor woman's husband away and took the burning carpet. Then, the man swung and threw it at the monster. His strength was enough to throw the heavy carpet, which was on fire, quite a distance. Meanwhile, Lee Yeon-woo got to his feet, but was still breathing heavily. The events were moving too fast for him to keep track of them. All of his classmates were watching him, because they were afraid and worried that Yeon-woo had been infected. They shouted to him to react and turn to face them so they could see if the boy was infected or not. Park Min was the first to resent and betray Yeon-woo. He said that his classmates didn't like him from the beginning and were suspicious of him. Cold sweat ran down his face. Park Min was worried because he had touched Yeon-woo more than once and was close to the boy. He was at risk. The boy asked if Yeon-woo was infected. The teenager was breathing loudly. He was still coming to and trying to overcome the pain. Isuri looked at Yeon-woo with a stony and rather dissatisfied face. She began to have doubts about what her classmate was telling her. After all, his behavior was very frightening given the situation around him. Eventually, Yeon-woo gathered his strength and was able to defend himself by saying that things were not as they thought, and that the boy was not infected with the frog egg virus. Isuri did not get out of her character and asked Yeon-woo to tell them how he knew people were infected. She asked if the man with the immunity told her. The girl said it in front of everyone, even though Yeon-woo had told her in secret. Isuri betrayed him too. Yeon-woo replied rather rudely that it was none of Isuri's business. Meanwhile, the guy was able to get up and come to his senses. He spoke and looked much better. Everyone around him began to believe that Yeon-woo was not infected. But Isuri was a stubborn girl and said that she demanded that Yeon-woo tell her and everyone. Yeon-woo just exploded then. His nervous system could not withstand such a load. Everything that had happened in the last few days, the loss of a friend, betrayals, the virus, terrible pain, and now the pressure from his classmates. The guy told them to shut up and remember that he was the one who saved them all. The company of traitors was shocked by Yeon-woo's behavior. They all did not expect the guy to react like this and yell at his supposed new friends. Yeon-woo added that he had already said that he was not infected, but he was still under suspicion. His eyes looked so crazy. Yeon-woo added that they should all take care of themselves instead of blaming him. The teenager said this out of emotion, and he knew he would soon regret it. Isuri caught the essence of his words. Her expression immediately changed and her eyebrows furrowed. The girl did not like the fact that Yeon-woo did not say something. She asked if it was one of them. Then, Yeon-woo's eyes grew wide. He suddenly realized what a stupid thing he had said on the spur of the moment. He should have been more careful, because the boy knew too much. Isuri went on to say that she had come to this conclusion from his words. She could see by his expression that he had said too much. But now they would not leave Yeon-woo alone until he told the truth about who he was. Suddenly, Isuri's face changed dramatically. From a stone, faceless expression, it became frightened. The girl realized from Yeon-woo's reaction that there was an infected among them. She turned to her classmates and asked Yeon-woo if it was true and there was someone infected among them. Suddenly, my eyes fell on Park Min. He looked quite frightened by what he had just heard, somehow even more than the others. The guy started talking to divert suspicion from himself. He asked Janhwa who he was. The boy stared at everyone and looked at his classmates. Park Min looked at Yeon-woo in confusion and asked him again, as he didn't say what he was staring at. The boy's gaze was indeed slightly downward. Yeon-woo replied that he was looking at his feet. Then Park Min asked what it meant. His voice began to tremble. Yeon-woo looked Park Min in the eye with a calm expression and told him that the boy was infected. The teenager was dripping with cold sweat and he was scared. All of a sudden, Park Min attacked Yeon-woo and grabbed his shirt. He called him a bastard and was very angry. But Yeon-woo was as calm as possible and did not react to Park Min's actions. He only asked if his classmate understood what he was saying. After that, he repeated that he was infected. Yeon-woo looked up at his classmates and said that he didn't know about it until he was hurt. And now he decided that he had to tell everyone. After all, soon the hidden cells would start to activate. But Park Min was not confused and said that he thought that Yeon-woo started accusing everyone only because he was under suspicion. He said that the teenager had crossed the line when he decided to take care of him. Park Min still hadn't let go of Yeon-woo's t-shirt. Suddenly, Kang Ji-hoon broke into the fight. He broke up the fight and attacked Yeon-woo, outraged by his actions. The headman told Yeon-woo to stop. He asked who the boy thought he was for accusing Park Min of being infected. Yeon-woo did not look up. He looked down at the floor and asked Park Min if he really thought Yeon-woo was joking with him. After that, the teenager raised his head and looked into Park Min's face. Yeon-woo spoke very seriously and confidently. He looked his classmate straight in the eye and said that he had been clear and precise. At the end, he added that they would see who was right. He added that he didn't know how much longer Park Min could ignore him. The classmate looked at Yeon-woo with intense hatred. His eyes were burning with anger. Suddenly, soldiers in suits and with a fire hose in their hands entered the room, interrupting the teenager's fight. At that moment, everyone turned to the sounds coming from the first floor. Suddenly, one of the soldiers gave the command to start the fire. As if on cue, I heard the screams of zombie monsters burning alive. The whole first floor became so hot from the intense fire. It felt as if the lights had been turned on again, because it also became very bright instantly. Meanwhile, the woman attacked by the zombie monster was screaming in pain. She was being devoured by a big, ugly giant. The soldier noticed this and realized that he had to act immediately. He had a Molotov cocktail in his hand. He started running to the woman to set her and the monster on fire. Suddenly, he heard the soldiers say they were going to the second floor. That was where they were all located. This made the soldier stop. Two men in uniforms with fire hoses stood on the other side of the door. One of them said that the target had been found. Did they really want to burn all these innocent people alive? Meanwhile, the woman was screaming and begging for help, while the monster wrapped its white tentacles around her. The victim thought that the military would have saved her. They were looking at her and the zombie monster eating the poor thing and pointing fire hoses at her. She was screaming and begging for help. She looked at the military with her eyes filled with fear and sincerely hoped for salvation, although inside she realized that her death had come. But the military could do nothing. One of them gave the order to burn, and then the men started shooting, which completely enveloped the woman. She was not visible at all, only screaming. The screams were hellish. You wouldn't wish that on anyone. Other people were watching. They were frightened because they were worried that she would not suffer the same fate. The woman's husband screamed. Before his eyes, the love of his life was being burned alive. A few minutes ago, they had been hugging and crying with happiness that they would soon be rescued. The man was broken, so he started shouting at the military and calling them freaks. He was indignant and asked what they had done. The military did not pay attention to this. It was clear that this was not the first time this had happened to them. They were just doing their job. Suddenly, the man said again on the radio that they had found several carriers of the infection, hinting at all the survivors who were on the second floor. Suddenly, the muzzle burst into flames. Fire began to pour out of it like water. The military man was the first to notice it because he was the closest. His look changed dramatically. He realized what was about to happen and reacted quickly. The man shouted for everyone to run as fast as they could and flee as far as they could. People began to react, although not everyone understood what was about to happen. Suddenly, the entire balcony of the second floor went up in flames. The military just ruthlessly decided to burn these innocent people. They did not know for sure whether these people were infected. The teenagers ran as fast as they could while the entire building was on fire. Suddenly, everyone present began to realize that the government didn't care about them at all. They were just bargaining chips that could be burned just like that. The shelter was no longer a safe place for them. Kang Ji-hoon said that the soldiers were right. They thought that people were in contact with zombie monsters. The starosta was outraged by this. It was unfair to them. Kang Ji-hoon shouted that it was some kind of punishment. Just then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that soldiers with fire hoses had also entered from the other side of the entrance. Kang Min saw this and screamed. He realized that he was probably going to die. They would all be burned alive. A group of homeless people were sitting in front of the military. A hose was pointed at them and they were about to open fire. Just then, one of them told the military to stop. The man raised his hands in the air as if to show that he was surrendering and shouted that they had done nothing to warrant being burned alive. The homeless man asked the soldier what was wrong with them and why they did it. Kang Min saw that the homeless people were not going to run away and hoped and believed that the military would help them. But he realized that they would face the same fate as they would have if they had not run away. Suddenly, something lit up the faces of the soldiers. They could not see anything. Then Kang Min shouted for the homeless to run away and pointed his flashlight at the soldiers. All the other teenagers were hiding behind him. The uniformed soldiers shouted at Kang Min to turn off the flashlight and called him a freak, shielding their faces from the light. Suddenly, monsters began to descend from above. Kang Min made it special through his observations. He realized that the monsters were flocking to the light and took advantage of this to have them attack the military, who were eager to burn them all. Kang Min continued to shine the light on the soldiers while they pointed their hose muzzles at the zombie monsters and burned them. A soldier ran to the teenagers. He was sincerely worried about the boys and asked if everyone was alive. When the man reached the door, he pushed it with his elbow to get out of this hell as quickly as possible. After all, they would not leave them alive. But the door did not give in easily. Then the soldier began to use his legs to kick it open. The man was nervous because he had to act quickly. Behind them, Park Min and Ham Song-yu stood and watched as Kang Ji-hoon and the soldier tried to kick down the door to get out of the room. Suddenly, Park Min turned to his friend. He told him that the only way he would be saved was if he got out of the building. Park Min continued that he saw a point outside the window where people were gathering. He added that only Ham Song-yu knew about it. Suddenly, Park Min suggested that his friend get rid of everyone else and head to that spot together. Ham Song-yu was surprised, but answered positively, because he wanted to get out of the room alive. Suddenly, the homeless began to run toward the teenagers and shouted at Kang Min to wait. The man asked to go with them. The soldier was a little surprised by this request. The homeless man shouted that they had to take them with them because the company didn't exactly know Seoul like the back of their hand, unlike the homeless who knew every nook and cranny of the capital by heart. After these arguments, the idea of taking the homeless with him no longer seemed so ridiculous to the military. Suddenly, the company heard the military running behind them with fire hoses. One of them shouted to the other workers that he had found the fugitives. The man in uniform added that they had found people who were possibly infected. This meant that they were about to open fire on the company, so they had to run and get out of the room immediately. The soldier realized this and shouted to the others to start running away immediately because they had to save themselves. At the same second, a lot of fire was fired at them, which caused everyone to fall. The fire even poured out of the window of the room. There was a lot of it. Meanwhile, the news showed that public peaceful rallies against the government had begun. The civic group Justice said the government had known about the mutated cell problem in Seoul beforehand. According to Jong, Si, and Bong, the first report was received from Yang Jong in Mapogu 15 days before the blockade of Seoul began. Anonymous sources obtained relevant documents confirming the systematic concealment of information by the authorities, but the government claimed that this was impossible. As for the fake news that fueled the conflicts, the government's clear response was to maintain its position. People were watching all this. It looks like they were sitting in another shelter. It looked exactly like the shelter where the teenagers were. A man with a white shirt and stubble walked through the people and carried hot ramen in his hands. Some girl was looking down. She had dark short hair and looked very upset. The man sat down with the woman and complained that the line for the canteen was so long. He offered the woman ramen and called her his beloved. They seemed to be husband and wife, but she didn't want to eat. Didn't even look at the steamed noodles. The woman said she could not think about anything. The man hugged her and said that she should eat. He asked her how long she planned to starve. The woman cried and said she couldn't get in touch with Jeon-woo. She was waiting for a call and said she was just going crazy over it. It turned out to be Jeon-woo's parents. The father immediately began to calm his wife down and said that maybe the boy was tired and was sleeping. He added that the woman had called before and said that everything was fine and they were in a shelter. Suddenly, the news showed such news that everyone started listening attentively, and their attention shifted to the information the reporter was talking about. The news showed a room that was a shelter for teenagers. The man began to talk about the terrible fire that occurred last night, which destroyed the evacuation center of Seoul Station. The news said that the fire was caused by refugees who did not follow the rules of quarantine. They deceived everyone. Yeon-woo's parents were listening to all this. His mother's eyes grew as big as an orange when she heard that there had been a very large number of victims. The woman screamed her son's name. The puzzle was solved, and she decided that the boy had not answered the phone because he had died in a fire. Meanwhile, the teenagers were all sitting in a dormitory. It was a room with a lot of beds. Everyone was united and didn't talk about quarrels. The homeless man was also there. He must have brought everyone to this place. Some people were lying on the bed and sleeping. Others couldn't sleep and were thinking about something else. But in general, the room was quiet. The man came into the room and went to the window. He said that Seoul was closed. A soldier came up behind him. The homeless man asked him if he thought the man should just sit in the room and wait for a miracle. There were some soldiers walking downstairs in uniforms that resembled the uniforms worn by the workers in the shelter that burned down. The soldier told the homeless man that these children had come from the village for a tour of Seoul and had no place to stay. The soldier asked him if he could ask the homeless man for a favor. The man told him not to worry, because the homeless man already owed a debt to the military for saving them from a burning shelter. He told the soldier that they could stay as long as they wanted. It turned out that the room where the company was located was a homeless shelter. Meanwhile, the soldiers in yellow suits asked someone for cooperation and added that it was for their own safety. They told people that they must have escaped from the shelter earlier that night, so the military did not burn them alive. The military asked if they had been in contact with the cells at night, or if someone close to them had. But the frightened people were silent. Some were not sure they were not infected, and some were afraid to tell the truth. The soldier began to talk about how they might have felt nauseous or upset or other people around them. Suddenly, Park Min raised his hand from the crowd. The man asked what he wanted to ask him. Park Min said he ran away and asked what he should have done. He added that his friend was showing signs of infection, and then he asked if he had reported it. Would the military have taken care of it? Meanwhile, Jeon-woo stood alone in front of the window on the stairs. He wanted to be alone and think about what had happened that night, to analyze how he felt. He took his hand again, although it no longer hurt this time. Jeon-woo suddenly remembered a woman yelling at him that he was infected because he looked like that. The teenager's breathing became faster again. The memories came flooding back one by one. Then Yeon-woo remembered how Kang Ji-hoon said he was immediately suspicious of him, and then asked if Yeon-woo was infected. The word was running through his head. He thought about how he could be sure that he was not infected. Meanwhile, Park Min was reporting a friend of his to a uniformed soldier. He began to say that as soon as he got to the shelter, he realized how suspicious he was acting. They put a blue mask on the guy, apparently to prevent him from spreading the virus. The guy continued that his friend looked very shocked and sometimes even flinched when he spoke to him. He went on to say that one day a woman noticed his condition and immediately said that he was infected. And then he said that this bastard just walked up to the woman and gave her the virus. Park Min was a great actor because he played his role as a victim perfectly. The soldier looked at the guy and sincerely believed him. He added that it was a very sad story and that the guy was a real devil. Then, another uniformed officer approached them. The man who spoke to Park Min asked the officer if they had verified the boy's story. The officer replied in the affirmative and said that they had found the boy's name on the list. They discussed that if they believed the public opinion about the super vector, it would undermine their credibility and responsibility. Park Min heard this conversation and thought about Lee Yeon-woo. He was very angry with him for daring to talk about Park Min like that. The soldier and the teenager were leaving the ward. The man in uniform told Park Min to follow him. Then, the man asked if the boy had definitely not been in contact with the infected person, to which Park Min said that he had stayed away from Yeon-woo from the very beginning because he thought he was too strange because of his behavior. Lee Yeon heard this conversation. The guy was standing in the front of the crowd and was also wearing a mask. Meanwhile, the soldier told Park Min to go to the waiting room. Lee Tae-in turned around to see who was slandering Yeon-woo. He immediately realized that it was him, especially since the red-haired guy could also sense the frog egg virus in Park Min's body. The soldier led Park Min to a waiting room. Some buildings were still burning. Meanwhile, the company was still in the dormitory where the homeless lived. Kang Ji-hoon jumped up abruptly on the bed and started scratching his head and screaming as if there were some nits there. The starosta turned to the audience and asked why everyone was itching so much. He continued to scratch his body. Suddenly, the boy heard someone laughing at his behavior and asked if he was bothered by severe itching. That was Kang Min. He advised his best friend to be careful with pillows. Kang Min said that all the bedspreads and pillows in the room had nits on them. Kang Ji-hoon jumped up and down and shouted in indignation. Meanwhile, Kang Min checked his phone. but it was almost dead. The guy went to the switch to check if the lights were on, but it turned out that there was no electricity. He asked what they needed now. Kang Min said that his phone was dying. Kang Ji-hoon asked again if there was a power outage. Ham Seong-yu was listening in on their conversation. Suddenly, the guy laughed at them and called them morons. The two friends turned to his provocation. Ham Song-yu looked down and laughed at them. He asked if the boys could do anything or if they were so stupid and incapable. Then, Ham Sung-yu looked up at his classmates and took out a power bank. He then added that they could forget whatever they wanted, but they couldn't forget about the extra phone charger. After that, the guy smiled sarcastically. Ham Sung-yu made fun of his classmates and ironically asked if he could share with them. But the boy forgot that he was without his friend and was in the minority. While Ham Sung-yu was choking on his laughter, Kang Ji-hoon and Kang Min noticed that he was without his faithful friend, Park Min. They asked why Ham Sung-yu was alone. This question made him very nervous, and cold sweat began to drip down his cheeks and his voice shook. He said that he did not know where his friend was, because they had separated when they came here. Ham Sung-yu started to say that, in any case, they were not close, and they were not friends at all. Then a soldier came into the room and overheard their conversation. The soldier decided to knock on the door so as not to distract the others from the conversation and not to scare anyone. Kang Min and Kang Ji-hoon turned toward the sound. The man sat down on the bed and said that he had studied the entire room. Meanwhile, all the teenagers gathered around him. The only one missing was Yeon-woo. The soldier said that it didn't seem like the building was in as bad a condition. He advised them to check it out for themselves and go downstairs. The conditions were normal, so the company could stay here. He began to tell me what was in the building. On the ground floor, there was a waiting room for the homeless. There was even a machine that made coffee, but without electricity, it was of little use. There was an office on the second floor, but there was no one there. It looked like all the workers had already been evacuated to the shelter. The soldier then suggested that the third floor was for sleeping, and downstairs was most likely the dining room, so there must have been food there. The teenagers hadn't eaten since last night, so they could use some food. He went on to add that maybe the homeless would still come here, but it was quite safe to stay inside. Suddenly, the man was interrupted. He turned to look this impudent person in the face, because the military man felt he was in charge of the company and expected to be treated properly. It was Isuri. She apologized for saying that even though they had just met, but she said it didn't make any sense. She asked if the soldier really thought it was safe indoors, because even in the shelter, it was not that safe. In general, nowhere in Seoul was safe, and they were not allowed to go outside. Then she added that the homeless were going to go back and forth. Isuri said that her husband had to close all the doors, otherwise they would have been infected as well. Suddenly, Kang Ji-hoon interrupted the conversation. He said that the girl didn't have to worry about the homeless because Yeon-woo was with them. The guy looked the girl in the eye and asked if Yeon-woo wasn't more dangerous. After all, his behavior yesterday was very suspicious. The boy was not acting normally around the zombie monsters. But Isuri began to defend her friend and asked if Kang Ji-hoon knew anything about Yeon-woo to speak of him in such a way. They had never spoken, and no one knew what the boy had been through in those few days. Then, Kang Ji-hoon asked, stammering, if Yeon-woo was infected. After all, Isuri's words sounded very confident, and she wanted to believe that the girl had never been stupid. Suddenly, the girl screamed. She broke down, saying that she did not know this information for sure. She told everyone to stop asking her about it because she had no idea what had really happened. In the back of her mind, she knew that Yeon-woo probably didn't fully understand whether he was infected or not. Suddenly, the girl asked them if Yeon-woo was not their friend. She added that if they were so curious, they could ask Yeon-woo about it themselves. Isuri continued that it was all quite strange. It was like they had left the guy in Namsan. She started to talk about something else when Kang Ji-hoon interrupted her. But Kang Min did not let the boy explode and shout and asked Isuri in a calm voice not to mock them. The guy took on the role of an elder, as it were, and started saying some pretty reasonable things. He said that they would try to understand the situation that had happened. He added that they had to cooperate now, otherwise they would be in danger. He sounded like a military man, but Isuri did not understand this tactic. She just laughed and said that no one would want to unite and cooperate with anyone. She added that no one would want to team up and work with him. The girl showed by this that she was clearly mocking and ridiculing the guy for everything they had done. Kang Min exploded and began to quarrel with Isuri. She was provoking the company, but he was the one who was acting out. Suddenly, a soldier joined the conversation. He started to get up and said that the teenagers had stopped fighting. He himself did not want to work in such an environment, because his life was also at risk because of their arguments. He told them to think again about where they should have stayed. But first, he suggested that they all go to the canteen and look for food. Kang-min and Isuri were the first to leave. The boy asked the girl if she had to behave like that in such a situation. She answered in the affirmative and ended the conversation. Kang Ji-hoon and Ham Seong-yu were watching. The boy asked his classmate if Kang-min and Isuri had been close before. The headmaster replied that it was nonsense. But Ham Seong-yu said that the two were always standing up for each other. Meanwhile, So-yeon was just watching what was happening. The girl didn't speak much and spent most of her time lost in thought. So-yeon went to the restroom to wash her face and clean up a bit. She didn't feel safe anywhere now. She was constantly stressed and anxious. She looked up and began to recall what had happened that evening when they fled the burning shelter. As she was running away, she noticed something. This memory made her shake with terror. There was a person in the fire directed by the soldier. He was screaming in pain. He was alive and felt everything that was happening. Perhaps that person was not infected at all and could have lived to a ripe old age. The girl was shocked then. Seeing someone burned alive was unbearable. The girl fell to the ground and held on to the sink. So-young wished so much that these memories would be erased from her mind. In fact, she wished that the last few days would be a dream, and she would wake up in her room in Namsan and get ready for a tour. Suddenly, the girl began to shake with terror. She did not want the enemy to see with their own eyes what she had seen yesterday in the shelter. After regaining consciousness, she decided to find a company and went up the stairs. But her mind was still full of thoughts. She was thinking about how others hadn't gone crazy after everything that had happened. She thought that they were being bullied because of her. She thought in her head that she really couldn't take it anymore. It was all very hard for her. She looked down as she walked, So-young didn't notice that Yeon-woo was coming down the stairs in front of her. It seemed that the teenagers were avoiding each other and did not want to meet even by chance. When she saw someone standing in front of her, she immediately looked up and was terrified. So-young did not expect to miss Yeon-woo. Her face betrayed the girl's surprise. Yeon-woo looked her in the eye as if he were superior to her. The feeling of guilt that emanated from So-yeon gave Yeon-woo a sense of power over her. The girl decided to talk to the boy and stammered out the boy's name, but he didn't even stop. He just went on downstairs, pretending that So-yeon hadn't been here. And the girl tried to say that everyone had gone downstairs to the dining room, but she couldn't finish. No one listened to her, and she realized that she should not have stooped so low. Yeon-woo was not ready for reconciliation. The girl stopped. Her legs did not want to walk away from this encounter. She realized that Yeon-woo had to come back sooner or later, because there was nothing on the top floor but the exit. But the guy did not return. He walked on and did not even turn around to look in the girl's direction, although he had previously admired her beauty whenever he had the opportunity. Then So-yeon turned around to see what Yeon-woo was going to do, but what she saw surprised and even shocked her. Yeon-woo was heading straight for the exit, and he had a briefcase on his shoulders. Why did he have a briefcase in the room? He didn't stop and confidently walked up to the door and then just opened it. Then the girl immediately rushed to him to stop him. She didn't want to lose her boyfriend again. The girl grabbed the boy's hand and shouted at him not to leave. She didn't even let him open the door an inch. She yelled at Yeon-woo and asked him why he needed a backpack. She bombarded her classmates with questions about how it was very dangerous outside and that he shouldn't have gone. But Yeon-woo began to resist, and So-yeon clung to him even more with both hands and begged him not to leave her. But Yeon-woo shouted at her to let him in immediately. The guy was behaving very aggressively and strangely. He was suddenly overcome with incredible anger and irritation. Suddenly, the guy pushed poor So-young and shouted at her to get out of his way. She fell down and screamed, because she could not imagine that Yeon-woo would do that. So-yeon fell down and almost cried from the insult. She was hurt both physically and mentally. She had just been humiliated. It was the second time. Suddenly, Yeon-woo screamed again. He was saying something he didn't know. The girl turned to look at her classmate. He looked at what he had done and screamed with anger. He was angry at her, angry at himself for hurting her just now. The guy said that he did not know whether he was safe or not, and that is why she was not supposed to approach and touch the boy. So-young was silent and just looked at Yeon-woo in horror. She didn't recognize her classmate. It turned out that she did not know the guy at all. In difficult situations, you begin to realize who is who. Meanwhile, the group looked around the dining room. Kang Ji-hoon was sitting at the table, and Kang-min and Ham Sung-yu were looking for something. It looked like the guys were actually starting to reconcile a bit and form a team. It turned out that the boys were trying to figure out the stove. Ham Seong-yu was indignant that it wouldn't turn on. Kang-min said that the stove was supposed to turn on and probably needed electricity. Ham Seong-yu asked what they should have done then. Meanwhile, Kang Ji-hoon sat behind them, looking intently at something on his phone. He was looking at maps. From the outside, it looked like he didn't even blink and just stared at his phone. Kang-min, meanwhile, asked if Ham Seong-yu had a lighter. He was told that why would a high school student have a lighter? Kang-min didn't believe it and asked again, but his classmate told him that he really didn't have one on him. Suddenly, Kang Ji-hoon turned abruptly and looked at the door. The boy asked aloud why the others did not come down. They seemed to be the only three in the dining room. Suddenly, the guy heard a ringtone coming from his phone. He looked at the screen, but the number was unknown. Kang Ji-hoon finally decided to pick up the phone and speak. On the other end, he heard a woman's voice that sounded familiar. She was asking if it was Kang Ji-hoon. Suddenly, he recognized this familiar female voice. His pupils dilated sharply, and his heart suddenly beat faster. Kang Ji-hoon jumped up and asked if it was his classmate Hannah. Meanwhile, on the ground floor, So-yeon was getting up after falling. Jeon-woo looked down, but in So-yeon's direction. He was still ashamed that he had hurt his classmate. The girl tried to talk to him normally again. She said she did not understand the boy's feelings. Everyone was worried because the situation was unusual and dangerous. So-yeon added that going out alone was not an option anyway, because it was too dangerous outside. Jeon-woo turned away from the girl and just looked at the street. She suddenly said that since he was not infected, he had to stay inside with them all. But the guy did not respond to her. He clearly decided that he had to leave to sort himself out and not put anyone in danger. Yeon-woo looked down and simply opened the door and started to walk out, leaving So-young. Suddenly, he heard some sounds from the street. It made him look up. Then, Yeon-woo saw another batch of homeless people enter. There were 3 men of different looks. One of them saw Jeon-woo and asked who he was and what he was doing here. Suddenly, the guy felt this pain again. His body seemed to shake and his heart was beating frantically. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Ham Seong-yu heard Kang Ji-hoon talking about Hannah. He turned around to see what was going on and what was going on. Kang Ji-hoon was actively talking on the phone and asking Hannah where they all were. Hannah said quietly, covering her mouth with her hand, that they were hiding in a building. In fact, the girls were trying to get back to them, the girl explained on the phone. Meanwhile, Han-mi was sitting behind her. She wrapped her arms around her legs and looked down. Suddenly, she heard that Hannah was talking to Kang Ji-hoon. This information made her happy. Hannah, meanwhile, continued that they hadn't been able to contact them because their phones were dead. Then my classmates started to say that they were now in some alleyway, and there were a lot of signs for travel agencies and companies. The last thing the girls said was that their phones were almost completely dead, when suddenly, the connection was cut off. It seems that her phone had died after all. Meanwhile, Kang-min and Ham Seong-yu had already approached Kang Ji-hoon and asked what had happened to the girls. The headman told them that their phone had died. The guy quickly tried to call the girl again, but in response, he heard from the phone that the number he was trying to call was unavailable. Meanwhile, Jeon-woo and Isuri were already sitting together. It seemed that the boy had changed his mind. Perhaps because he felt threatened by the homeless and wanted to warn others. Isuri suddenly suggested that they go together. Jeon-woo immediately turned to the girl. He did not expect to hear this from her. She repeated that if Jeon-woo wanted to leave, he would have taken her with him. She didn't even look in his direction. Again, she had a stony expression on her face. Suddenly, Yeon-woo said something that made Isuri look at him. He agreed to go with her. There was even some romance in it. He looked at what was happening outside and said that they would definitely escape from this room, but not now. Yeon-woo added that they would first observe the situation before running away, but Isuri did not understand what Jeon-woo meant. She asked him if it was a rejection on his part. She added that it hurt her pride, to which the boy replied that he did not mean it. Jeon-woo explained that he was worried about something. He could feel the presence of the infected and wondered if it would be okay to run away on his own. What if these people became really dangerous? Isuri grimaced. Once again, Jeon-woo said things that scared her and gave her the creeps. She suddenly grabbed the guy's t-shirt and yanked, telling him to follow her and stop talking like an idiot. She dragged him up the stairs. Yeon-woo shouted for the girl to let him go. Isuri eventually let the boy go. He asked her what she was doing with him. Suddenly, her tone changed, and she said that it seemed Yeon-woo had misunderstood her. The boy's face changed dramatically. Isuri began to say that among all those present, only Yeon-woo was suspected of being infected. She added that the boyfriend made her feel special because he could tell the difference between the infected. Yeon-woo did not like this tone of communication, so he interrupted her as much as he could. Yeon-woo said that it was he who saved them then, and did not understand why the girl was exaggerating. He then added that she had also saved him in a shelter when they were in danger. She suddenly called the guy a fool, and said that she just knew the location of the hydrant and the emergency exit. How else could she have helped him escape? The girl added that she would never have acted if she had doubts. Yeon-woo felt deceived by her words. Then he asked if he could just leave the girl here if he had doubts. This development of events did not suit the girl, and she openly showed her indignation. Yeon-woo said that she should understand the feeling of being left behind in danger. He said he didn't mean anything by it. These were the last words of the boy. After that, he simply turned away from Isuri without even looking her in the eye. Then the guy just left. He was going down the stairs and probably intended to escape from the premises. Isuri swore out loud and said how sick of it she was. Yeon-woo continued to go down, waiting for the girl to do something. He wondered to himself if he had gone too far. He thought about what had happened when the homeless people went inside. Yeon-woo thought about how, even when he wasn't thinking straight, he still grabbed So-young's hand and simply led her along. They ran away together, and Yeon-woo protected her. He wanted to do this unconsciously, without realizing it. He began to recall the beginning of the school trip and how in love he was with So-yeon, how he used to look at her all the time. Yeon-woo began to think that maybe all he wanted to do was get closer to So-young. Suddenly, his dreams were interrupted, and the guy returned to this terrible reality. 3 homeless people stood in front of him. One of them pointed at Yeonwoo and said that he was the guy who ran away from them when he barely saw them. Yeon-woo realized that from the outside it didn't look like it was happening, so he began to explain to the men why they had fled. Suddenly, a man in a hat told Yeon-woo to come over to them. He added that they were all very offended and called the boy a jerk, but the homeless people surrounded him, not giving him any passage. Another said that Yeon-woo still had the courage to snap at them, but the guy only offered to discuss everything, and he would explain how it really happened. Suddenly, someone intervened in their fight. This someone told the gentleman to be careful. All 4 turned to see what was happening and who was saying it. It turned out to be Isuri. The girl looked at what was happening with a stone face. She suddenly said that Yeon-woo had symptoms of infection, and that even among their company they tried to avoid him. The homeless people immediately started screaming and getting scared. The men ran upstairs, screaming in fear that they had not touched him. Isuri's plan worked, and Yeon-woo's face was left intact. The girl saw that Yeon-woo was just staring at her and told him to stop doing that. She explained that she didn't help him because he was nice. She added that staying here wasn't such a bad option, as long as they didn't let the infected in. Then, she looked at Yeon-woo. She looked him straight in the eye and told him that if he was going to leave, he just had to take Isuri with him. Meanwhile, the teenagers were sitting in the dining room. So-yeon joined them. Behind the door in the next room, there was a homeless man and a soldier. They were looking out the window and discussing something. The homeless man asked if the soldier wanted to leave the room for a while. He received a positive answer from the man, but the homeless man decided to ask if the soldier was sure of his intentions, because it was very dangerous outside. The homeless man went on to say that he had heard that much of the frog egg virus had been exterminated, thanks to the fire at Seoul Station. But there was another danger. If they faced the cleanup army, they would have no chance. The homeless man continued that this army exterminated all the people of no fixed abode in the area, hiding behind the virus warning. The homeless man said that the man should have realized this himself. He asked if the soldier wanted to go that far and advised him to value his life as well. He agreed with his friend's words, and then he started talking about a woman who really wanted to become a teacher. Although she never took any tests, she still remembered her unrealized dream while working in the private sector. Suddenly, the soldier said that this wonderful woman had always wanted to teach children, and then he added that she was his fiancée. The soldier started talking about his beloved. He wanted to finally get it off his chest. He said that his fiancée always bought the children all kinds of sweets after their exams, and when he asked her why she did it, the bride replied that she just liked to make children happy. She liked children's simplicity. Suddenly, the soldier said something that shocked the homeless man. The man revealed that perhaps his wife could forgive him if he helped and protected these teenagers. Then the soldier decided to join his classmates and tell them about his plan. He said that he had learned from a man about a square with a bunch of private bureaus. The man put together the information from the driver and this information and found the location. Kang Ji-hoon's briefcase contained Molotov cocktails. The soldier distributed them based on past bitter experiences so that the bottles would not explode all at once. They also prepared special clothes. The soldier was going to go with Kang Ji-hoon because it was his idea and desire to save Honmi in the first place. The starosta turned to his friends and cursed the girl, saying that she was nothing but trouble. Suddenly, Kang Ji-hoon told his classmates not to worry at all, and that their team would be back in less than an hour, so fast that they wouldn't even have time to blink. The team was leaving the room. Kang Ji-hoon looked down as he left. Suddenly his gaze went up. He noticed someone, which made him stop. Jeonwoo and Isuri stood in front of the team. The boy was carrying a briefcase, which raised questions. The classmates just looked at each other. Suddenly they exchanged a glance, looking each other straight in the eye. I could see in their eyes that they had a lot of questions for each other, but they were not going to talk. So the teenagers just missed each other and went their separate ways. Suddenly Kang Ji-hoon stopped. He had something to say and he couldn't hold it in any longer. The headman told Yeon-woo to forgive him. Kang Ji-hoon began to sincerely apologize to Yeon-woo. The guy turned his head in his direction in surprise. He did not expect to hear this from a traitor. Kang Ji-hoon continued and said that he did not expect the guy to forgive him. The starosta suddenly remembered something. A memory from the Namsan cable car came to his mind. When he and Yeon-woo went down to the floor where the girls were, they were in danger because the zombie monster was about to grab them, and then his beloved Hanmi would have died as well. Suddenly Yeon-woo was not afraid. He ran to distract the monster and thus saved the girls. Then everyone survived. These memories made Kang Ji-hoon's heart beat faster. He was very worried about his Hanmi, even though he didn't show it. Then, the headman simply said that he was indebted to Jeon-woo for this act of his. Meanwhile, Isuri heard someone in the room arguing and talking about someone bringing someone here. The teenagers didn't say anything to Kang Ji-hoon. They just all went on their way. Yeon-woo turned to look at his classmate and consider the sincerity of his words. Kang Ji-hoon simply walked out of the room and went to look for Hanmi and the other girls. When Yeon-woo and Isuri entered the room, they saw a picture of a soldier telling So-yeon that she could not go with them